So welcome back, everyone. I'm Tracy Schneider from Temple Emmanuel. I organize all the programs for active older adults at the Temple. And welcome everybody again. We have Betsy from Jewish Family and Children's Services. She is
I was waiting.
If everybody could mute themselves, please, that would be great. She's a social worker from, she earned her MSW from the Columbia University School of Social Work and her undergraduate degree from Brandeis University. Prior to coming to JF&CS, Betsy worked at the Massachusetts Voter Table as their development manager and field coordinator. She also worked as a tenant organizer, specializing in organizing tenant associations and advocating for tenant protections with all populations, including older adults on the city and state level. Just mute a few more people. Tonight, we are discussing, as part of our four-part series with What Comes with Aging, depression in older adults. What does it look like and how can we help? And I also want to take a minute to thank the Newton Senior Center for co-presenting, for publicizing this program, the Temple Emmanuel Adult Education Department, I want to thank the Temple Emmanuel Senior Fund, as well as there was a private donation from a Temple Emmanuel family to fund this series. So I really that. So Betsy, welcome everybody, and let's get started. Again, we'll hold the questions to the very end. Comments you can put in the chat, and if you have a clarification, please just put it in the chat, and I can try to interrupt Betsy for that. But questions we'll hold to the end. Welcome.
Hello.
Everybody could mute themselves.
Great. So thank you, Tracy. Again, I'm Betsy. My title actually at Jewish Family and Children's Service is Mental Health and Wellness Engagement Manager, but that's just a very long-winded way of saying social worker. And I do trainings like this for both older adults themselves and people that work with them, care for them. And I also facilitate two support groups at JF&CS, one for people who are grieving a spouse, and another for people that are taking care of someone who has Parkinson's disease. So I guess I see a lot of this in the field, but I don't know. I think I recall some of you came to the presentation I did last week on ambiguous loss, and your contributions like really kind of make these trainings sing. Like Tracy said, I think maybe there's definitely going to be time at the end for questions or experiences you've had. And yeah, last week I kind of it was sort of peppered more into the presentation. This time, like I said, we'll have time at the end. So I'm gonna just share my screen here and get started. Go to the beginning here. Okay. All right. So depression in older adults, what does it look like and how can we help? And I should say before I continue, I am, like I said, I'm a social worker. I'm not a clinician. I'm not a medical professional. So sort of how we can help is more how we can work together as a community, not, we're not going to be diagnosing anybody, but there still is a lot that we can do to support older adults who have depression, short of a diagnosis. So I just wanted to start with a couple of facts about depression in older adults, just to ground us a little bit. It is the most prevalent mental health problem among older adults.
Hi, if everybody can mute themselves, please.
So it is the number one most commonly diagnosed mental health problem among older adults. And actually, I just heard a statistic that it's the most common reason given for disability actually across among all adults. But it's important to remember, and if you remember nothing else from this presentation, I want it to be this, that depression is not a normal part of growing older. We'll talk a little bit more about why that misconception exists. Certainly, there are lots of things about getting older that are really difficult for people, but depression is still, a distinct condition, and it is not an inevitable part of aging. And the vast majority of cases, 80% of cases, are treatable. So it's really that much more of a tragedy that people kind of don't think that depression is something that they do think it's a normal part of aging, because it's definitely not. And it very, very often can be treated. It's not something that, older adults just have to live with. But at the same time, like I said, there are a lot of things about getting older that can make it a lot harder for older adults to either get a diagnosis in the first place, or just, feel like they have to struggle because they think it's something that just happens. So of course, just being sick can trigger depression, but biochemically, and just because of the difficulties of living with a chronic illness. And at the same time, another challenge that a lot of older adults face is that a lot of illnesses mimic the symptoms of depression. Or it's that just kind of can happen as a result of the diagnosis. So for example, dementia for a lot of people can cause depression, or can cause memory loss. So then it becomes a challenge to kind of figure out, like, well, is this person showing symptoms of memory loss, or is it just the kind of the fog of the depression? There's also a lot of people with Parkinson's. A lot of people say the most difficult part of that diagnosis can be the mental health challenges, more so than the physical challenges, which are kind of what people tend to associate with Parkinson's. So that's something that's really, really difficult. And the people that are the best able to kind of disentangle what is what are geriatric psychiatrists, and they are in very short supply. Mental health professionals in general, there's a pretty severe shortage. I'm sure a lot of you are kind of familiar with that. It's been written up a lot. I think it was the case before the pandemic, but now it's really, really acute, because a lot more people are having mental health struggles. But particularly those who specialize in the older adult population, they're just not, the demand way outstrips the supply. And of course, it's a time where there's a lot of life changes and changes of roles. I know retirement can be really, really destabilizing for people. Of course, there's many wonderful things about being retired, and no longer working, lots of, more time with your family, more time to travel, just not having to work all day. But it's also a really profound transition. Your role has changed, and, a lot of people really struggle with that. Or for a lot of, just the loss of independence is really difficult for a lot of people. And sometimes they're going from being a caregiver their whole life to being cared for. These are all things that are just profoundly life-changing, these transitions. And of course, kind of underlying all of this, really, the water we're all swimming in is ageism. Like I've said, a lot of people really believe that life just gets much more difficult when we age. And of course, there are times when that's true, but it's not true across the board. So there really is this belief among a lot of people that it's just something that is inevitable and has to be lived with. And of course, that's probably the same reason why there's not, people that specialize in geriatrics, because they just don't make a lot of assumptions about older adults. And I also, again, this is certainly, we're not trying to diagnose anybody here, but there are some kind of distinguishing characteristics of depression in older adults. Oh, I see there's something in the chat. Well, I'll keep going and we can go back to that. So I'm just going to read these all out loud in case it's a little bit difficult for people to see. So these are common symptoms of depression in older adults. Sadness or feelings of despair, unexplained or aggravated aches and pains. This phenomenon has a term called somaticization. I think I'm saying that correctly. And what it is basically kind of the physical manifestation of depression. So for example, somebody may be talking about stomach troubles or backaches or some kind of other physical ache and pain that they don't really have a diagnosis for. It's not something kind of historically that they've had. And it's kind of their body's way of expressing their depression. And it's not to say that the aches and pains that they're feeling are not real. They absolutely are. It's just they kind of can't be explained by anything else. So again, it's just sort of the way that their depression is being manifested. And I think this can also occur in there's some languages don't really have a word for depression, or there is of course a huge stigma still against mental health diagnosis. So that's something that sometimes it's sort of expressed physically. And of course, a loss of interest in socializing or hobbies, weight loss or loss of appetite, feelings of hopelessness or helplessness, lack of motivation and energy, loss of self-worth. Again, going back to, the changes that can come with retirement or having people needing to care for you after being a caregiver your whole life. Slowed movement or speech, which again is something that can be really easily confused or mimicked by kind of a lot of other health conditions. Increased use of alcohol or other drugs, fixation on death, thoughts of suicide, memory problems, which I talked about before, and neglecting personal care, skipping meals, forgetting medicines, neglecting personal hygiene. And there was something else here that I just got, it got cut off when I was doing the cutting and pasting, is sleep issues are also can be a sign of depression, either someone not sleeping enough or sleeping excessively. So that's just kind of something to kind of watch out for among people in your life who you think may be struggling with depression. And I think something else that can be really, really difficult about discerning whether someone you love or care about is going through depression or not is just that as we age, we have more losses. More important people in our life have died, or we're mourning other losses, which I talked about a lot in my last presentation. So I also just wanted to share some points about kind of how you can maybe distinguish between the depression and grief. And sometimes, of course, grief can trigger real depression, or someone already had it and grief just makes it that much worse. But I do think it's important to distinguish because we don't want to pathologize something that is a very normal response. But of course, we also don't want someone to be suffering when there is help out there for them. So generally, and I would just say, given my experience working with people that are grieving, certainly people are still very much mourning. There's people in our group that their spouses died now 3 years ago. And of course, they're still really deeply mourning that loss. But if it's to the point where a year after the loss, if somebody is still really kind of unable to function in their day-to-day life, that's something that is a bit of a red flag. or if they focus intensely on the loss, or alternatively go out of their way to avoid any reminders, that's a sign that they're just, and again, everybody processes things differently. There's no right or wrong way to grieve. But again, if the focus on the loss is so intense that they're not able to live kind of any semblance of the life that they had before, that's definitely something that should be of concern. And again, isolating or withdrawing from others. And of course, if anyone is talking about harming themselves or others, that would demand kind of an immediate response. Calling 988, which I have the information on in the end of the slides, or even 911.
Betsy, can we
Yes.
go back a slide? I just want to ask a clarification. You had
Sure.
many things, symptoms of depression. So if someone's on this call tonight and they're looking at all of that, how many, all of us may have, like, I don't sleep well, like all of us may have some of this. Somebody may have just lost some weight, but how many of these symptoms actually is a red flag to, like, maybe call our doctor? 5 of them, 10 of them, how many?
That's a good question. Yeah, I would say 5 for sure. Yeah, 5 to me is, and this is just my opinion. Because yeah, I know that I go through phases where I sleep terribly and it seems to completely pop out of nowhere. And certainly being on Zoom a lot really zaps my energy. And yeah, there's a lot of other reasons for some of these, but I would say, yeah, 5 or more. Definitely you should talk to your doctor.
Thank you for clarifying.
If only to rule out, other things too. Because like I said, there's a lot of these can show up in different illnesses. So, okay. And so I have a clip from a wonderful TED Talk from a psychologist named Andrew Solomon. He wrote, I think to me, he's most known for writing a book called Far from the Tree, which is, I have not read it, but it is about parenting children who have kind of various mental or physical illnesses. And he has this wonderful TED Talk, which I encourage you all to watch the entire thing. It's 30 minutes. I'm not going to play it all here. But I just wanted to just have a clip. He breaks down, I think, very well how to kind of distinguish between quote unquote normal grief and depression. And I will just note now, this is the first time I've had a YouTube clip in one of these presentations. So hopefully it will work. If not, it's not a huge deal. But I just need to make sure I get to the right section so we're not watching 30 minutes. Okay, so.
There's no such thing as love without the anticipation of loss. And that specter of engine of intimacy. There are 3 things people tend to confuse: depression, grief, and sadness. Grief is explicitly reactive. And you feel incredibly unhappy. And then 6 months later, you're still deeply sad, but you're functioning a little better. It's probably grief. And it will probably ultimately resolve itself in some measure. If you experience a catastrophic loss and you feel terrible, and 6 months later you can barely function at all, then it's probably a depression that was triggered by the catastrophic circumstances. The trajectory tells us a great deal. People think of depression as being just sadness. It's much, much too much sadness, much too much grief at far too slight a cause. As I set out to
So yeah, so he says 6 months. A lot of the research that I've seen, and certainly among other social workers that I've worked with, a a year is sort of given as the time where people are still in very, very deep mourning. But I think he just summed it up really well, that there is a distinction between, of course, a catastrophic loss is going to be something that's going to be completely knock us back and is going to take some time to recover from. But it's the ability to kind of be a part, do anything that you enjoyed before, that really marks depression from sadness and grief.
Understand depression.
Okay. And so I can share, I think that the link is, I actually don't think the link is in the slide, so I can share it with Tracy. But we have a really, really wonderful resource at Jewish Family and Children's Service that I have a physical copy of it, but you can easily get a PDF from our website called, and it's really for people that work in housing where older adults live, but I have found it to be really a great resource for anybody who works with older adults in kind of any capacity. It's called Tips and Techniques for Supporting Residents with Mental Illness. And that is directly where these talking, and there's tips for talking through people with a very large variety of mental health issues, ranging from dementia and Alzheimer's to schizophrenia. And I think it's just really, really helpful and very kind of explicit language that is helpful to use.
Betsy, could you send that
yes.
afterwards, and then when we send the video out, I can send that to everybody.
Yes. So yeah, I'll send out the link. You need to fill out a form to get it. It's free. You just have to fill out a little form online. I think just so they can kind of track how many people have it. And if that has, we did recently update our website. If anything about that has changed, I'll let you know, but I'll send out the link to Tracy, and then she can share it with all of you.
And again, another clarification, someone just put in the chat, and this seems pretty obvious to me as well, that somebody wrote that they've observed that, if a parent loses a child, it's a totally different trajectory about grief.
Yes.
And, if you lose a 95, I mean, don't take this the wrong way, everyone, but if you lost a parent who 95 years old and lived a very long life, of course you're grieving because it's the loss of that relationship, but it's very, very different type of grief than a parent who loses a 5-year-old child. I don't think,
Absolutely.
So because one person has lived their life, and of course everyone's going to miss that person dearly, but the other person, it's just a different situation. So the grief may take longer, or just need, right?
Yes. I actually just on last week attended a conference for something called the Older Adult Behavioral Health Network, and JFNCS was a sponsor of the conference. And one of the speakers was saying that in her experience, the length of very deep mourning for people that have lost a child is, she said she's seen it be as long as 7 years, which is of course a very, very long time, but of course that's a catastrophic loss. And yeah, so there is, I think that's also important context. And that's actually why we have, there's information about this at the end of the slides, but we have groups designed for different types of loss. So the group that I facilitate is people who have lost a spouse, but we also have groups for someone who is grieving a parent, and for someone who is grieving someone who died by suicide, just because the context is very different for all of those. And so it's important that people are among others who understand. But I will say not every, there's JFNCS equivalents in most American cities. And I know that not all of them do it that way. Some places say a loss is a loss, and we all want to kind of be together for that. So if that's something that, and now all of these groups are on Zoom. So if that speaks more to you, you can probably join a group in another state.
And again, we're not trying to undermine
Right.
you know, an adult who lived their life and is in their late 90s or something. I'm not trying to take that loss away, but we're just trying to differentiate the difference of a parent losing a very young child. So.
Absolutely. So if there's an older adult in your life who you think may be experiencing depression, it's helpful to express concern, but give a specific example. Because I think if you just say, I'm worried about you, it's easier for someone to say like, oh, I'm fine. But if you say, oh, we missed you at this event that, that this person really was looking forward to or always goes to. I think that can kind of make people feel a little bit more seen and feel more comfortable talking about either, what's going on with them, or maybe there's a perfectly, understandable reason that they weren't going somewhere. But I think it's just a lot, and I'll talk about a little bit about this too, but a lot of older adults also feel isolated and lonely. So I think if you can say, giving a specific example is maybe can help someone to realize like, oh, someone does notice that I'm not doing things that I used to do. And the second point, state your belief that no one should suffer needlessly. Again, just really reinforcing that aging does not have to mean suffering. And just reinforcing that you care and that help is available is really, really important. And I also, I have another clip from the same TED Talk that goes into this, into a little bit more detail, because I think that there is still a belief among a lot of people, even now with our we're getting a more sophisticated understanding of mental illness and letting go of some of that stigma. But a lot of people just feel like, well, I don't want to be on medication for the rest of my life, or therapy doesn't work, or there's just, life is suffering. And so I think it's really important to kind of counter that belief. And then this is something that I think about a lot. Offer encouragement and support if finding a therapist or a group takes some time. Again, I have spoken to the pretty dire shortage of mental health professionals, again, across the board, because certainly, some people really do need to see a specialist and I forgot to mention before, another kind of wrinkle that makes diagnosis and treatment a little bit more difficult for older adults with depression is if someone is already on a lot of medications, that can impact how an antidepressant or anti-anxiety medication may work. It may be more difficult for them to absorb, or just, there's interactions that could occur with other medications. So some people would really, really need to see a geriatric psychiatrist. But finding a therapist across the board is really, really difficult right now, both just because of supply and also just getting to a place where you feel prepared to do that can take a long time. I mean, I know in my own life, when I have gone through really difficult things, it still took me about a year after that difficult thing to even feel like I was ready to really give therapy a try. And of course, not everyone is going to like every therapist they have or support group. Some the chemistry is off, or it's just not something that works. So I think helping people through that gap where they may know that they want to talk to somebody, but it's just a long road is really, really important. And of course, keep checking in with a person and acknowledge the positive steps that they've taken. I think, and I added the discreetly there because I think it can make people feel really uncomfortable if they haven't been going to events for a while and then they go back to one and it's sort of this over the top reception. Or it can kind of veer into being a little bit patronizing. But so much of, and this is I always say at the core of every presentation I'm doing is basically the very, very severe problem of loneliness, particularly among older adults. So acknowledging when people are reaching out is, I think, really, really important. Because I think loneliness kind of builds on itself when people feel isolated for such a long time that it really starts to impact their self-esteem, and make doing even really relatively simple things can feel really challenging. So I think acknowledging the positive steps is really, really important. Okay, and then I have one more quick clip. I just want to make sure I have, again, I'm going to the right. Oh, I'm sorry, this is really small.
Mutual secrecy. There is some to reach out. One, and Lolly came in, and this is what she said the day she came in. One of them wants to be a preacher, one of them wants to be a firefighter, and especially among the indigent. And I turned in my story, and my editor called me and said, "We really can't publish this." And I said, "Why not?" And she said, "It just is too far-fetched. These people who are sort of at the very bottom rung of society, and then they get a few months of treatment, and they're virtually ready to run Morgan Stanley. It's just too implausible." He said, "I've never even heard of anything like it." And I said, "The fact that you've never heard of it is an indication that it is news." You are a news magazine. So after a certain amount of negotiation, they agreed to it. But I think a lot of what they said was connected in some strange way to this distaste that people still have for the idea of treatment. The notion that somehow if we went out and treated a lot of people in indigent communities, that would be an exploitative thing to do because we would be changing them. There's this false moral imperative that seems to be all around us, that treatment of depression, the medications and so on, are an artifice and that it's not natural. And I think that's very misguided. It would be natural for people's teeth to fall out, but there is nobody militating against toothpaste, at least not in my circles. And people then say, well, but isn't depression part of what people are supposed to experience? Didn't we evolve to have depression? Isn't it part of your personality? Which I would say, mood is adaptive. Being able to have sadness and fear and joy and pleasure and all of the other moods that we have, that's incredibly valuable. And major depression is something that happens when that system gets broken. It's maladaptive. People will come to me and say, I think though, if I just stick it out for another year, I think I can just get through this. And I always say to them, you may get through it, but you'll never be 37 again. Life is short. And that's a whole year you're talking about giving up. Think it through. It's a strange poverty of the English language, and indeed of many other languages, that we use the same word, depression, to describe how a kid feels when it rains on his birthday, and to describe how somebody feels the minute before they commit suicide. People say to me, well, is it continuous with normal sadness? And I say, in a way, it's continuous with normal sadness. There is a certain amount of continuity, but it's the same way there's continuity between having an iron fence outside your house that gets a little rust spot that you have to sort of sand off and maybe do a little repainting, and what happens if you leave the house for 100 years and it rusts through until it's only a pile of orange dust. And it's that orange dust spot, that orange dust problem, that's the one we're setting out to address.
So yeah, I just liked that the addressing that, yeah, there is kind of this belief that depression exists for a reason, and that even some people think, well, it's inspired lots of art and expression, but that's really, if you really kind of think through that line of reasoning, that's just throwing away lots of potential. And I think the way that, Andrew Solomon put it, that, yeah, maybe you could get through feeling depressed. It could heal on its own, but that's time that you'll never get back. And it doesn't have to be that way. actually what he starts off the video saying is that, the treatments that do exist often feel very inadequate. And of course, they're hard for people to access. But there's still so much progress from even the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And he's hopeful that if future generations will think what we do now is not enough, because we'll have something that's better.
So now,
Oop. And as I kind of alluded to before, we as just caring people have to acknowledge that there is only so much that we can do, especially if someone's depression is very severe or treatment resistant. There isn't really a lot there. They need to see a professional, but the problem of loneliness and isolation, which again is certainly not limited to older adults, though it can be particularly acute with older adults, has become such a profound problem that the Surgeon General of the United States, Dr. Vivek Murthy, has declared it a public health emergency. Granted, it does not come with the same kind of funding and mechanisms that something like the COVID public health emergency does, but it's really kind of more symbolic of trying to show that loneliness is its own epidemic and has really profound health impacts for people. And he's actually written a whole book about it. Which I believe the book actually came out right before the pandemic. So this is something that's been really, really prevalent in our country for a long time. But he has a lot of kind of concrete ways that people can feel less lonely, which is the toughest part of this conversation, because I think it's easy to see why people are lonely, but it can be really hard to address that. Excuse me. So his recommendations are to reconnect with people. I've seen in a number of articles, he talks about putting aside 15 minutes, at least 15 minutes each day, to reach out to people that you care about, family members, friends. And while doing this, to minimize distractions, to just make it so you're having a really, really profound connection with somebody, which is much easier said than done. I know I find it really difficult now to even watch a TV show without also being on my computer or on my phone. But multitasking in that way has actually a lot of what the research is showing is that kind of the more you're online, the more social media you're using, even though you're in some ways in community, actually leaves people feeling more lonely. And then this is something else I struggle with. If someone calls you, pick up the phone. Even if you can't actually talk right at that moment, you'll still have, I think, as he puts it, 10 seconds of hearing someone's voice who you care about, rather than not taking the call and say, oh, I'll call them later. I'm very, very bad about that. And then another thing and I've also talked about this a lot in other presentations I've done, is encouraging everyone to volunteer, to serve others in some way, which again, it's somewhat easier to do that now, even for people who are maybe not comfortable leaving the house or not able to leave the house. Just being a part of having a volunteer commitment or being part of some kind of activism movement is really, really great for actually decreasing loneliness and being a part of something that's bigger than you. And I mean, I've seen, as Tracy mentioned, I come from the tenant rights movement, and I saw so many older adults who oftentimes had little or no biological family close by, or that they had any kind of relationship with, build up a real social group and find a lot of purpose in activism. Of course, that was often because they were at risk of eviction, which is, nobody wants that, but they really found a lot of meaning even after that they had kind of become more stable, found a lot of meaning and community in continuing to be part of the tenants' rights movement. And of course, as we've been saying, if kind of none of these things are really working to fix your depression or apathy or in yourself or in someone that you care about, reach out and get some help. And I will say support groups and things like that are much easier to find and take part in right away than finding a kind of traditional therapist. And so again, I'm just going to share some resources that we have at JF&CS. If you got the slides from my last presentation, these are all the same, but I'll just go through them again for folks who weren't at that presentation. This number one resource that I usually direct people to is CJP Senior Direct, because that's an information and referral service. And we do have, within that, we have another division called Your Elder Experts, which is geriatric care managers. But if you call CJP Senior, and that there is a fee for those services, but if you call CJP Senior Direct, you can talk with somebody who can just give you information and to resources for anyone of any income. And I've talked a lot about how difficult it can be to find a mental health professional at this moment, but that is what Mental Health Connect does. It's a service that was launched by JF&CS fairly recently, and it is specifically for finding more long-term mental health care. So you can just call this number, email, and someone will work with you to help find, again, this is not really like acute crisis care. It's more kind of long-term. But if somebody is in crisis, the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline is available. And that is a national effort that is not just through JF&CS, not just Massachusetts. And it is, so you can, and you definitely should call it if you or someone that you care about is in crisis, but you actually don't have to be to call the line. I don't know that you can find long-term care, but you can call if you're feeling kind of depressed or anxious, but not thinking that you're going to sort of immediately harm yourself or somebody else. And again, as I mentioned, there's a lot of kind of overlap of depression and some other medical conditions, particularly in older adults. We have a really great kind of suite of services and groups for people with Parkinson's and their families. As I mentioned, I facilitate one of our care partner support groups, but there's also groups for adult children of people with Parkinson's and programming for people who have Parkinson's themselves. And it's still mostly on Zoom. Some of it is back in person, but there's always going to be virtual options. It's just been really, even something like Parkinson's Dance, they just had something in person in late April, but it was not, people just seem to really prefer doing the virtual option. So there's always going to be that. We have a lot of resources for people with Alzheimer's, other family support. There's a group for people, children caregivers of people with dementia that meets, I believe, once a month. Dementia Friends is actually, I think, originated in the UK, but we have a chapter at JF&CS. That's a really wonderful training, which I would definitely be happy to do. It's basically just so people can understand kind of what dementia is and how it can really impact people, and also has really practical ways, tips for communicating with people with dementia. I personally knew almost nothing about dementia before doing this, and I found it to be really, really helpful. And lastly, the Betty and Greenbaum Miller Center for Jewish Healing. That's the program where the bereavement groups are housed. And as I mentioned, there are support groups for people who have lost a spouse, people who have lost a parent, and people who have lost someone by suicide. And if any other groups come, that's for older adults specifically, that this website is where they will be. I should also mention, I mean, we're talking about very specifically about older adults here, but we also have many support groups for new parents. That was actually how I discovered JFNCS, at joining one of the groups myself. So it's wonderful that now I work there. So there's really across the lifespan, but of course we're focusing on older adults now. And yeah, that's my presentation. I am excited to see the chat. I think we can probably stop.
Let's stop now. I'm going to stop the recording. I want to thank you very, very much for this presentation. And I know we'll have the recording. We'll be able to send it out. So let me stop the recording.